Okay, thank you all. The topic that I'm going to speak about today is community building and promoting governance in the Toronto District's Board of Education and whether that can offset austerity. So what I've done is, in this paper, I've presented sort of a bit of background first. So I start by looking at some of the neoliberal approaches that were used in the United States in the 1980s and 90s, and particularly one of the most influential documents, A Nation at Risk, which called for increased accountability in education. And that particular document drew a lot of attention, and it drew a lot of interest from Canadian academics as well. And so there was this call within Canada to look at what was happening in the United States and look and seek out opportunities to increase academic standards and reduce educational costs to enhance competitiveness. And these views actually made their way into Canada. And I just want to say at the beginning, in terms of thinking about this with respect to austerity, I'm relying quite heavily on the work of MacLellan, who wrote a book that was published last year called Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea, which will frame what I'm going to talk about today in relation to the activities of the Toronto District School Board over the last number of years. I also just want to touch on, in the paper I go in much more explicitly into neoliberalism, but I just want to point out three documents that sort of were key to this view gaining momentum in Canada. One was the Economic Council of Canada, when before it was dismantled, had a document called Allowed to Learn, Education and Training in Canada, which set out this idea of sort of how we connect education and training to meet the needs of the marketplace. And then a report by Radwanski, Ontario Study of the Relevance of Education and the Issue of Dropouts, which again pointed out to the importance of connecting training to education. And then finally, the Ontario Premier's Council, which was quite certain in its observations and recommendations of enhancing the skill level of students to meet this new global economy that started to get a lot of traction at that time. This idea that the only way that we could be competitive was by putting in these very sort of training programs within our schools. And then Ontario responded to a lot of these concerns, and it was about time that we had a Royal Commission, because we hadn't had one for a few decades. So the Royal Commission on Learning, in its just over 100 recommendations, was very clear about the need to restructure education in Ontario at the elementary and secondary panels to create what they call these an accountability regime, also regulate teachers' work, which Andy talked about just a few minutes ago with the creation of the Ontario College of Teachers, and increase standards. And this was sort of the undercurrent of the Royal Commission on Learning 4-volume set, which had a sort of a neoliberal approach to it with respect to its view of education. And the aim of these documents, including the Royal Commission on Learning, was to try to align education with this increasingly competitive global economy that everybody was concerned if we didn't get on board, that we would somehow fall behind and sort of then become kind of a less successful economy and country. And so a number of austerity measures became part of this approach, and a lot of these were driven by the state policies with respect to education, with the goal of increasing accountability in order to make our economy more competitive. With respect to the Toronto District School Board, it was at a point where we had at that time 6 boards, and the government of Ontario, through 2 pieces of legislation, Bill 104 and then Bill 148, firstly, it amalgamated the old city of Toronto and Scarborough, East York, into this new megacity. And then almost in the next step, it created the Toronto District School Board that came as a result of that. So you had these 6 school boards, and if you include Metro, 7 school boards all coming together under one entity. And that resulted in a fairly, the largest board in Canada overnight, in a city that was going through huge changes just in terms of its political and administrative structure. So if you look at, these are stats from the Toronto District currently, but at the time they were closer to 250,000 students, closer to 600 schools. Now there's 591, about 17,000 permanent staff, and 175 different student nationalities, all within the Toronto District School Board, and 75 different language groups that suddenly now fell under the responsibility of this newly created Toronto District School Board. And so we created an interesting set of challenges for the newly created Toronto District School Board. And I did a series of interviews with trustees to get a sense of how this was playing out. Some of the trustees had been in the former board, some of them were in the Toronto District School Board. And so I have a number of quotes here throughout this presentation for you to give you a sense of the flavor of how this went down. One trustee who was a member of a pre-amalgamated board basically said that it was an absolute disappointment, absolute fear, and absolute anger. We went in kicking and screaming. There was a lot of, obviously, opposition to the creation of the Toronto District School Board. Shortly after the board was created, it faced a very serious financial situation. In 2002, there was some serious dissension with the Ministry of Education to the point where the board itself got sidelined, and a supervisor was appointed to oversee the finances of the board because the board refused to balance the budget, and there was a requirement within the Ministry of Education to balance the budget. So that created a lot of dissension on the board because there were some board members who were pro in favor of balancing the budget and others were anti. So that in itself didn't help the board to become harmonious at all. It actually added to increase dissension within the board. And then we started to see a slight change here. In 2002, Brad Gonski, who was the president of the University of Guelph, was asked to write a report on the financing of Ontario schools and boards and he recommended that in addition to the amount of money that the government of Ontario should reintroduce into school boards across Ontario, an additional $250 million should go into the Toronto District School Board to deal with the complexity of what the board was going through, particularly as a result of the amalgamation. And when I spoke to one of the trustees, said to me, you know, he had to remember all the time that the TDSB is the largest board in Canada, so it's really a flagship board for Ontario. So the government of Ontario is very cognizant that anything that's done to the TDSB has a ripple effect across other boards within Ontario. All through this period of time, the TDSB was really consumed with amalgamation and financial matters. There was very little attention directed toward community building or governance. It was just sort of surviving day by day with a lot of dissension and a lot of bad feelings. There was a bit of an educational renewal in 2003 with the election of the Liberal Party led by Duncan under this platform to revitalize education. And initially, they put in place a number of what were seen as positive steps to boost funding for teachers, revamped PD to demonstrate its commitment to education. And then in 2006, the Ministry of Education released a document called the Ontario Education Excellence for All, respect for Ontario school trustees. And there was a sense within the ministry, they felt that the trustees were of the mind that they had been devalued and not treated very well by the previous government, so this was a way to connect to them and reach out to them. The idea here was to create a new view for the trustees that would begin to lay the groundwork for promoting governance and community engagement. And shortly after this, Kathleen Wynne, who was the Minister of Education, sort of took a very big step forward and created a governance review committee, and it was charged with sort of 6 duties or 6 tasks to ensure per pupil funding, took into account the changes that had resulted under the Harris government, amalgamation of school boards into these large organizations and the challenges with that, the demographic shifts within the schools as a result of these changes, greater societal demands on schools that have resulted in more financial and administrative stresses, increased participation by parents and students in decision-making processes, and a substantial increase in provincial direction and intervention. So the task force was charged with examining all of these to see what it could do in terms of recommending how to deal with what were seen as the challenges that were before many boards in Ontario. The Governance Review Committee came up with 25 recommendations. Many of them dealt with issues around strengthening school boards, chairs, trustees, directors of education, audit committee, code of conduct, capacity build. Very thorough report that identified a number of areas where the ministry could work with the boards and make some positive changes. It also outlined some interesting principles of the relationship between the boards and the Ministry of Education to sort of create some sort of balance in there. And again, this report was another step to kind of lay this groundwork to promote governance and community building. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about governance. In the paper, there's a significant amount of time devoted to the literature on governance, but I just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot here. It's premised on affording a greater number of people an opportunity to have their views included with the goal of being better decision making. The Learning Partnership has written fairly extensively on this. It wrote that governance includes how the education system is organized and power is allocated and what structures decision-making processes are in place and formal roles and responsibility, which all sounds very well and good on paper, but in practice it's not so easy. As one trustee observed, in the practice we're dealing with what I would call governance cohesion, getting the board to work together, which seems like a very small thing, but it impacts everything if it's not working. So there were a number of board members I talked to who were very clear on this being very much of an uphill battle. And I wanted to just say a couple of things about community building, because that's also dealt with extensively within the literature review of the paper. There is a significant amount of literature out there on community building. So what I've done is just pulled out a couple of the items from the paper. It's our understanding of community has shifted over the last number of decades due to the changing nature of our society. And also, we focus on community in terms of the relationships that exist between the school board and its many constituents. It's not just parents any longer. We have a whole host of other people that are interested in what's happening in our schools. Chief among these relations are parents, which many school boards recognize as crucial to the maintenance and the continued support. However, as one trustee said, we cannot expect bureaucrats and teachers alone to run our schools. Given everything that's happening from Safe School Act to the dropout rate, we need to get more community involvement in our schools. The school board can no longer work in a silo. There's a sense that had been what had happened certainly since the creation of the TDSB, that it was very much focused on this idea of financing and dealing with the onslaught of changes that were coming from the government. So in terms of community building and governance, good school community relations and effective governance structures rely on the effective board communication with the public. However, one of the challenges here is the size of the TDSB. As I said earlier, according to one trustee who made, I thought, a very insightful comment, it's very difficult to be a trustee over an area of size that is the same size as what a member of provincial parliament represents. We have twice the size of our Toronto Council's ward. It's difficult to run an election, raise money, and to be out there in the community as much. I used to be in my school all the time, and now she says she's hardly ever there because she's inundated with a lot of other requests. And then another trustee commented that governance is a big issue now that's been on the table for a while. This is the time now for the board. They're either going to sink or swim. So there is a sense that the board has to really take this by the horns and make some sort of changes. So going forward, there's a number of observations that have been suggested in terms of how the board might be able to sort of deal with this. Effective leadership is important, but this change, as we know, is compounded by the lack of roles and responsibilities that the board is still trying to deal with, even after it's 10, 12 years after its creation. And also this idea that there's such diversity across the TDSB that it's going to be difficult for the board to try to find common ground across those various communities. But there is some work that's being done by Johnson, who offers sort of 5 approaches that I think might provide some sort of guidance here. One is to creating a vision and setting realistic goals, using data to monitor progress and take corrective action, building awareness that leads to community engagement. These are not revolutionary. It's a nice sort of baby step approach to how we can maybe think about putting in place governance and community building under this sort of period of austerity within which we still exist. 4, support district leadership in promoting staff development. And 5, demonstrating commitment to student learning by promoting governance. So I thought these 5 approaches would help to at least begin to lay some of the groundwork here. In conclusion, one of the trustees who I spoke to, I thought had summarized very nicely. He was one of the last trustees that I spoke to, and he said the governance issue has been at the TDSB for about the past 10 to 15 years. I'm not sure whether our historical reliance on being incremental will carry us through these new challenges. So there is a sense within, particularly a number of the trustees, that they have to really try to take hold of this issue if they're going to make the kind of progress that they want to in order to build good, strong community relations, and also put in place proper governance structures. School boards that understand their communities are much better situated to assess these needs that are before them, and there are different needs depending on the boards. But as we know, austerity measures will continue to probably stand in the way of many of the school boards across Ontario, but also school boards in other parts of Canada as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.